Welcome back to Bible Backdrop. My name's Nicole, and today we are digging into the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. If you want to follow along and read it for yourself, it's in Matthew 26, verses 36 through 56, Mark 14, verses 32 through 52, Luke 22, verses 39 through 53, and John 18, verses 1 through 12. Understanding where the Garden of Gethsemane was, the Mount of Olives had many private enclosed gardens. This would be somebody who was well off and probably had some money would buy a little area of ground. They would close it off. It would be their private garden. Jerusalem was very hot. It was very busy. It was very stone-like in all areas, and this would be a way for them to get away. And here Jesus is going to the Garden of Gethsemane after the Last Supper with his disciples. This is not his Garden of Gethsemane, but somebody who has lent it to him as a time for Jesus and his disciples to be able to get away. If we remember, right after the Last Supper, Judas leaves. The disciples are thinking that he's going to pay for dinner or he's going to help the poor, but we know that Judas is actually going and speaking to the chief priests as Jesus and his disciples leave that upper room to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's about a mile walk from where we think that upper room was to where the Garden of Gethsemane is. And so that mile walk, I'm sure Jesus is kind of having all this turmoil within him as he knows what is about to happen. He knows at that moment that Judas is meeting with those chief priests. Now, as we go into the Garden of Gethsemane, we see that Jesus leaves some of his disciples towards the front, but he goes a little bit deeper in, and he brings with him Peter, James, and John. Now, he even says in Matthew 26, verse 38, to these three men, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." In other words, don't leave me, be with me. And perhaps Peter, James, and John saw a different side of Jesus because understanding that he is crushed with grief, this is one of these few moments where we see these human emotions come out of Jesus. He was in anguish. It was like his human nature was struggling. And if anybody ever questions, did Jesus have human emotions? This right here is a perfect example of the human emotions that Jesus felt. He knew what lay ahead of him in the hours to come, and to the point where he was suffering physically, almost to the point of anguish, because what was about to happen. So why? Why did this have such suffering for Jesus? Well, you see, when we understand that Jesus even says, "Your will be done." In Matthew 26, verse 39, Jesus says, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done." He had a firm trust in God. He knew what he was about ready to walk into, but he had a trust in God in the midst of it. And he was choosing to follow through with this. It wasn't Jesus being forced to follow through with what was about to happen. The anguish he was feeling, he was choosing it. In the Garden of Eden, there was a decision made that would have led to eternal damnation for all of us. But here in the Garden of Gethsemane, a decision is made that is going to lead to salvation for so many of us. And as Jesus says, "My Father," when we look at the Aramaic word for that, meaning Abba, it actually describes daddy, but it's almost more intimate than the way we refer to daddy. It's thinking of it more of an intimacy, an endearment. It's almost saying, "Daddy, wherever you go, I'll go. Daddy, I want to be with you. Daddy, I love you." As he says, "Abba, Father, Daddy, if it's possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet, I want your will to be done." Hearing the anguish in his voice. What was the cup of suffering? Well, Jesus was about to bear all of our sin. And we're going to get into that in the videos to come as we understand the crucifixion and what was really going on and in those last words of Jesus on the cross. But understanding here that what Jesus is preparing for is to bear our sin. And when he bears our sin, he is separated from God. He cannot bear our sin and be separated from God. Jesus has never left God's side. For eternity before and here while he is on earth, God is with him. But the moment he knows that he bears and he takes on all of our sin, he knows there will be a temporary separation from him and God as he gives his life for our sin. That is the cup of suffering. It's being separated, alienated from God. Even for a brief moment, it is bringing him to anguish because God is his everything. Jesus was expressing some true feelings, but he chose not to rebel against God, his calling and his life. And I will tell you that anything worth having costs us something. And Jesus knows this. It is going to cost him his life, but he knows it is worth going through. But as he is in this anguish, these three disciples, Peter, James, and John, keep falling asleep. And here he says, go ahead and sleep. Have your rest. But look, the time has come. The Son of Man is to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Up, let's be going. My betrayer is here. I think it's interesting that he knew that Judas was on his way. He was about ready to walk into the garden before anybody else knew. He knew he was coming. And he could have been frustrated with his disciples as they kept falling asleep when he needed him most, when his emotions were in turmoil within him. But he didn't get mad at him. And when it was time to go, he said, let's be going together. In other words, it's all right if you keep messing up. Come on, let's go. The time is at hand, and I want you by my side. John 18, verses 2 through 8 is one of my favorite translations or verses about this Garden of Gethsemane, and I want to read it over you quickly, but it says, now Judas, who was betraying him, also knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples, meaning the Garden of Gethsemane. So Judas, having obtained the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, came out into the open and said to them, whom are you seeking? And they answered him, Jesus, the Nazarene. He said to him, I am he. And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. Now then, when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. He then asked them again, whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus, the Nazarene. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you are seeking me, let these men, meaning his disciples, go on their way. Okay, I just want to unpack this story for just a minute. A cohort of Roman soldiers is coming with Judas and the chief priests, and the Pharisees are also with them. Now, a cohort was 1/10 of a legion. A legion was 6,000 soldiers. So a cohort is 600 soldiers, okay? So this is 600 soldiers coming to get Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I just look at that and I go, that's amazing. There's that many people. And Jesus disarms the mob right away by coming out to him. He's not hiding. He's not behind a stone. He's not sending out his disciples to speak for him. He is coming right out in the open and says, who are you looking for? Everybody knew who he was looking for. But then Jesus says, I am he, when they say Jesus the Nazarene. And I want you to understand the word he is ego iami, which is a declaration of deity. He's saying, I am he. I am God. And I want you to understand what it says here in John. It says that everybody hit the ground, fell to the ground. 600 soldiers holding torches, holding swords, full of armor in their Roman gear hit the ground. Could you imagine the clanking, the torches flying, the swords falling, because Jesus simply said, I am he, and they cannot stand. There is power. There is power within that. And as the captives were sprawled out on the ground again, he said, whom do you seek? I love this because I imagine these 600 people like making their stance, like when they get ready to say, oh, we got to say Jesus the Nazarene again. Am I going to hit the ground again? That was so weird. I couldn't even control myself, right? And they do. They say it again, Jesus the Nazarene. And Jesus said, I am he. So if you're seeking me, let my disciples go. But then comes Judas's kiss. And Judas walks up, and Jesus says in Matthew 26:50, my friend, go ahead and do what you have come for. Now, I want you to hear the way Jesus addresses Judas. He says, my friend, I know you betrayed me, but you're my friend. Jesus is still loving on this man in the midst of his betrayal. You see, a kiss from a man would have been something customary at the time. It wasn't something to look at and go, well, that's kind of gross. No, a man to kiss another man was a moment of brotherly affection, of brotherly love. It meant something, but it simply wasn't. It was something you would do on occasion to other men, and it was probably something the way they greeted each other normally as they considered each other family. And here Judas goes over to kiss Jesus, and believe me, it wasn't if the guard needed to know who was Jesus. They had seen Jesus. They saw him on the triumphal entry. They had seen him around town. The Romans soldiers knew Jesus's face. However, by the kiss, it's actually said that that was Judas's way of saying that he would be the formal accuser of Jesus, because they were about ready to go into trial. And so that was his way of saying, I am saying this is the man, and I will be his formal accuser, betraying him with a kiss. And that's what Luke says, as Jesus says after the kiss, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Something, a term of endearment or brotherly affection, and that's what you'll use to betray me. You see, Jesus was arrested by Roman soldiers, but not under Roman law. If we understand the time and the situation and the political environment, which we're going to get into next when we dig into the trial of Jesus, but the religious leaders could only arrest for minor infractions. They truly had no power. They had to concede to the actual Roman officials. So the chief priests could only do very, very minor things, but they brought an entire Roman guard. How did they justify that? And I think the answer is when Jesus' words in Mark 14, verse 48 through 49, he says, am I some dangerous revolutionary that you come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was among you, teaching every day. But these things are happening to fulfill the scriptures that say about me. In Luke 22:53, he ends that same clause by saying, but this is your moment, the time when the power of darkness reigns. See, he opens it up saying, am I some dangerous revolutionary? And we're going to see that as we dig into the trial. They have brought the Roman guard because the religious leaders know that they have very little power. They could not crucify Jesus on their own. If they took that kind of power into their own hands, they themselves would be in trouble under Rome. But they did know if they painted Jesus to be a dangerous revolutionary, then Rome themselves would have their ears perked up to this man that could be trying to overthrow their own government. But here Jesus pointing out and saying, why didn't you just arrest me in the temple when I was among you? Calling their bluff on who he really is. But Peter being mad at how dare you bring 600 soldiers to arrest my Jesus, takes out his sword and he swipes the ear of Malchus, which is the chief priest's servant. And I have to say right here, it's evident that Peter was definitely a fisherman and not a swordsman, because he probably didn't intend to just swipe at the side of his head. He probably was going for the big guns, but he just takes off his ear. In Matthew 26:52, Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, put away your sword. Don't you realize that I could call thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? I love this because Jesus is saying, don't think because of the reason that I'm allowing these guards to take me that I am powerless. No, I could call thousands of angels right now to save us. But I need you to know that I am doing this for intention and for purpose. I don't need you to defend me. And I think there's a lesson in that just right there. How often do we feel like we need to defend Jesus when we need to understand that he is perfectly capable of defending himself? Luke says that Jesus stooped down and he picked up that ear and he healed. He just put it back on Malchus's head and like nothing. And I have to understand these guards going, we're supposed to capture this man. And we all couldn't even stand when he said, I am God. We fell to the ground. And now I just watched him heal a man's ear. But I also want you to understand that if Jesus would not have scooped down and picked up Malchus's ear and stuck it back on his head, That because Peter raised a sword in front of the Roman guard, that there would have been 4 crosses on Calvary instead of 3, because Peter would have been up there too. It was definitely against the law and punishable for crucifixion if you raised a sword against the Roman guard. And here, Jesus heals Malchus's ear so that there is nothing for Peter to even be in trouble for. And then it says they all ran away, meaning his disciples. They scattered. These were the men that just hours earlier drank the grape juice, the wine as it went around the room, and pledged to never, ever leave Jesus' side. And yet when 600 soldiers show up, they scatter as fast as they can. And Jesus is chained up within his hands and walked away into the most corrupt trial. And we're going to get into that next time, but I want you to understand that those chains were not what bound Jesus in that moment. He could have broken those chains. What bound Jesus in that moment was the love for those disciples that just ran away and scattered. It was the love for the early church and the people. It was the love for the followers of him that were to come. It was the love that he had for you and I that bound him in that moment, that he allowed to bind him in that moment and walk away and go into this trial. Next time, we're going to dig into this trial, understanding what really was going on behind the scenes. We hope you will join us, and we hope you are gleaning something from these Bible backdrops.